Your voice, your opinion, your community. Fact TV, free speech protected.
Good evening, and thank you for tuning in to another edition of What Do You Think? I'm your host, Bill Morse. This is a call-in program, and today is Thursday, July 22nd, 2021. Three things on the agenda today. First, a short story that I came across while going to the town-wide flea market in Charlestown across the river in New Hampshire this past Saturday. And then we're going to wrap up Solzhenitsyn, our discussion on Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who for 18 years was a resident of Cavendish, not far from here. But before he was a resident of Cavendish, he was a resident of the Lubyanka prison, where he was held for, I think he was held for 3 weeks there while waiting for sentencing. And I'll give you a little more background on that. But anyway, we went to, Carl and I went to a town-wide flea market. If you're familiar with the flea market in Charlestown, it runs the length of Main Street or Route 12, and it starts at 8 in the morning. It was this past Saturday, and it ran till 2. And a lot of interesting things. It's some antiques, some yard sales, type of daily household stuff, some tools, a few other things, toys. But what I liked was many properties are open, or you can trespass and not be not run into any confrontation because there's stuff out on people's lawns, on blankets, etc. And so anyway, I walked maybe a block off of Main Street, and there's what used to be a bank. I believe it was called the Connecticut River Bank in the 1800s. It's a 1.5-story brick building. The brick is recessed in archways, and if you look at it, the strength of the construction, the granite foundation, the red brick body of the building, it looks like something, either a bank or some type of small little fortress. Speaking of fortress, I also learned that Charlestown in the 1670s was the furthest northern point of civilization along the Connecticut River. I know many of you are familiar with Deerfield, Massachusetts. Deerfield was an outpost along the Deerfield River in the later 1600s. Evidently, Charlestown, which was also known at one time as Fort Number 4, because Charlestown was encircled by a fence. And there was one skirmish, or one battle. The French, with the help of a tribe, came down and wanted to take over the fort and thus kick out the British, I believe it was the British presence in that part of the New World of northern New England. And they met with a resistance of about 300 well-armed men. I don't know if any of them were connected with Ethan Allen and his mountain boys across the river in nearby Vermont. Vermont at this time did not exist. We're talking 1660s, and they repelled the French and the tribe, the Indian tribe that was working with the French to gain control or regain control of certain areas of New Hampshire and Vermont. So I thought that was cool. The town was encircled by a fence, a stockade fence for protection. But anyway, getting back to the bank. The bank is now an Anglican church. The pastor and his wife, David and Jean, very cordial, and they showed us in. The first timed vault, I believe, in America is in that bank. If the vault is still there, it's used for storage, not a confessional. And the door is open. You can see the intricate mechanics of wheels and geared wheels and springs, etc. And according to David, the pastor, this was the first timed vault door in history, or at least in the U.S. history. Anyway, he also told me about this story of a bank heist that took place, I'm going to say, in the late 1840s, because the railroad's involved. And I'm pretty sure the railroads did not get up into this area until the late 1840s. So anyway, the heist was overnight. This was before the vault was, before the present vault. I'm sure it was just an iron strong box. And because there was some industry in the area, there was payroll. And there were two thieves, broke into the bank, the building that is now the Anglican Church, just off of Main Street in Charlestown. They broke in, and they made off with $15,000. We're talking $15,000 of late 1840s money. And they made their getaway in a buckboard. A buckboard is a type of open carriage. And the buckboard was pulled by one horse. We don't know the horse's name, and we don't know the name of the two thieves. I just heard about this Saturday. If I feel like it someday, I'll look into more details. Anyway, they took off. They left Charlestown. They went through Alstead, which is by a country road. It's probably the next town to the east. I'm not sure where they were headed. They made it as far as Marlow, and Marlow is towards the center of the state. And we're talking about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, and it's pitch black. There's no moonlight. And this is where their plans kind of went askew. They forgot to bring light. So there's no street lights. We're in 1840. The roads are not paved. They're just gravel roads with ruts. And they were kind of like feeling their way along this road. And all of a sudden, the horse decided he had had enough of this. And so the horse veered off the road onto a cow path and would not stop. Evidently, the horse not only was able to outrun the two thieves, but he was able to avoid pitfalls that the thieves were not able to. In other words, the thieves fell over uneven ground, rocks, and somehow the horse made it to a farm not too far away where he turned himself in. The two men could not find the horse, the buckboard, nor the $15,000 that was in this iron strong box that they had taken from the bank. Somehow, I don't know how the hell they did it, but they made it to Keene on foot. Now, if you can imagine going through the woods along gravel roads from the Marlow area to Keene, it's not a short hike. But they made it to Keene, and they took a train back into Massachusetts where they had come from. Well, the farmer notified the sheriff, or the constable, I believe he was called. He found out there was a reward for the capture of the criminals and the return of the $15,000. So he says, I want the reward. This is the buckboard. The buckboard actually had a nameplate on it which listed the owner. The two thieves had rented the buckboard and the horse. So the constable, over a period of time, because we're talking pre-telegraph here, over a period of time, weeks I imagine, he contacted the owner of the buckboard and the horse, found out who the buckboard was rented to, and captured the two thieves a number of months later. The banker in charge of that branch of the Connecticut River National Bank, or whatever it was called, was happy to get the $15,000, but it took a while for the reward to come through. And I think they were trying to save money for that timed vault that was going to come around in another 20 years. Anyway, the farmer did get a reward. The horse went on to pull other buckboards. And I'm not sure how much time. I'm sure the two fellows that were caught spent some time in jail, because $15,000 was a big haul in the late 1840s. So that's a little slice of local history. I thought it was cool in that there were slices of modern detective work. I mean, if you change the mode of transportation, the story could have been told today. And today, $15,000 would be nothing to sneeze at either. So, anyway, we have a caller on the line. Kurt, do you have it? What did you think of the story?
Quite interesting, and as you say, it's local lore, and particularly some interesting things about the bank's vault being the oldest one in the country. Who would have thunk?
Right, with a mechanically timed mechanism for opening it. In other words, you could lock it overnight and it would not release. You know how the door itself has bars that extend into the jamb of the door frame. Well, it would automatically retract after a certain amount of time had gone by, so it would retract in time for the bank to open in the morning. And I'm sure it was probably a clockmaker that designed the mechanism that allowed the door to be timed as to when it would shut or when it would lock and when it would reopen. So, but yeah, it is an interesting story. Okay, cool. So, last week we talked about a local connection with a Soviet, well, former Soviet because he's passed on, defector. Many people will recognize his name, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He actually lived in Cavendish. I believe Cavendish is on the Black River. It's a mill town. There's a wool factory there at one time. By the time, we'll talk about Cavendish and Solzhenitsyn in a minute. Just a little background. For people who aren't familiar with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he wrote a pretty interesting tale. Not a tale because it was based on his own experiences. He was an artillery commander in the Second World War. He was part of the Red Army. He was part of the Red Army's move westward out of the Ukraine, out of the former Soviet Union, through Poland into East Prussia, which was part of Germany, and then into Germany itself as the army was getting closer and closer to its objective, which of course was Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany. Anyway, a year earlier, Solzhenitsyn had written, he'd been in the army in this position of artillery captain for, I believe, 2.5, maybe 3 years. And he wrote a friend who was also in the military, his impressions. And some of the impressions were not favorable to the Red Army. Solzhenitsyn evidently complained that the logistics or the supply line was ineffectively handled. He thought that the troops were not getting sufficient munitions nor sufficient food in order to make a more spirited counterattack against the German Wehrmacht that had come in and occupied parts of Russia or the Soviet Union since 1941. And in this time of Soviet government, letters were intercepted and read. Nothing got through the censors. The censors read every bit of personal communication. They listened. They had the technology to bug phones and apartments or living quarters, working quarters. They had the technology and they made full use of it. Anyway, a year goes by since these letters are written. I think there's only 2 letters where he complains about the Soviet management of the Red Army. And he gets summoned. He's on his way to Berlin. He's actually, I believe, in Prussia, which is now the northwestern corner of Poland, but it was part of the German Empire, East Prussia. And he gets summoned to Moscow. And he's summoned by a captain of the NKVD, which is the Nationalist Security Force. And this force was the precursor of the KGB, which, like our CIA or M5 in Britain, is an intelligence agency. It's also a security agency. And they basically can have a directive from the premier, in this case Joseph Stalin, Comrade Stalin, who is bent on squelching any dissent against his rule. There's no important decision that is made without his okay. He's a micromanager, and he's he was an ideologue, and he was very brutal. I believe during the collectivization of farms in the Soviet Union, in particular the Ukraine, there were 5 million people who starved because the food that they were growing was taken away from them for the industrial cities where the Soviet Union was trying to increase its industrial output. And the industrial output was not for cars, refrigerators, record players, or televisions. It was for war material. Again, the idea was peace through strength, and many people believe that had Stalin been given enough time in the early 40s, he would have been the one who had launched an attack beyond his border into neighboring countries in an attempt to bring them under the communist, his version of the communist umbrella. So anyway, Solzhenitsyn gets summoned. He gets interviewed at the Lubyanka prison, which is in Moscow. Interestingly enough, the building is still there. It's about 5 stories high, occupies an entire block. There's a square or a plaza in front of it. And today it is used by Russian security forces. So it's interesting, an infamous building. Many terrible things happened within its walls to all people. So Solzhenitsyn was kept, I believe, for 3 weeks during the interrogation. He was subjected to psychological torture, but not physical torture. Fortunately, his interrogator, the captain, was more of a professional, and he played good cop, bad cop in order to gain evidence that Solzhenitsyn had written anti-Soviet comments in these letters. And Solzhenitsyn, to his credit, handled the questioning very well, even though he was sleep-deprived, food-deprived. Fortunately, not in solitary. He had the companionship of other people in his cell. But he he answered the question so that other people would not suffer the same fate, would not be arrested by the NKVD and then brought into Lubyanka for their own hellish experience of interrogations. So, on the two letters he wrote, the two people he wrote and complained to, they were not implicated. Thank God for that, and also thank the quick thinking of Solzhenitsyn and knowing how to answer these questions. So what we're going to do, I wanted to read a very short one-page excerpt of Solzhenitsyn's first day in a cell where he's going to be staying for 3 weeks during the interrogations. And once the interrogations are over and the NKVD captain gets the signature on a confession, then he can stand trial. It's a kangaroo court trial. Judge pronounces sentence, how many years he is going to get in a gulag, which is part of a prison system of work camps. Some are hard labor, some are not, depending on the severity of the offense in the eyes of the Soviet law system. So this first part I call, Are You From Freedom? I don't call it, that's the words of the prisoners. Are you from freedom? It was the first question asked of any newcomer to a cell. This is in Lubyanka prison in Moscow. Had he come from the outside? Could he give them news of the world? And when Sonia was asked it, Sonia was the nickname of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And when Sonia was asked it, having spent an eternity in the 2 weeks and 4 days since his arrest, he replied, no. A great dynamic painter like Ilya Repin should have painted that scene and called it Are You From Freedom? The open door, the young arrival in boots, gray coat, winter hat, half covering his shaven head, his arms enfolding a mattress, gazing in delighted astonishment at the three figures half rising from their bunks, removing handkerchiefs from their eyes, which are now screwed up to shield themselves from brilliant light bulb. The light bulb, which is part of the psychological treatment in the cell. Unending bright light. They can't sleep. In the center of the cell, a table on which are a teapot, a chess set, and a small pile of books. There is a blue paper blind high up on one wall, suggesting there may be a tiny window behind it. A rattle of keys woke Sonia from a dead sleep. 6 a.m. Under the dazzling light, he and the others leapt up, made their beds, then sat on them. Talking was not permitted. It was the worst time for depression, those 2 hours before the day properly began, especially for those who needed glasses to read. Glasses were always removed at night. 2 of the men in Sonia's cell were in that situation. They just sat on their beds like statues. Even if you had been interrogated all night, and that often happened, you were not allowed to nod off during those 2 hours. If you did, you were punished. You sat with your gloomy, oppressive thoughts in stifling airlessness under the relentless light. The only activity in those first 2 hours was toilet parade. They were led out in front. The duty prisoner carried, chest high, the 2-gallon latrine bucket. At the toilets, each prisoner was handed 2 tiny bits of paper. It was, of course, often not possible to defecate so early in the morning, in which case the whole day until 6 p.m. or even in some prisons the next morning would be a torture. The prisoner would be robbed of the inclination to talk, read, think, or even eat the meager food. And of course, that was intentional. At 8 o'clock, breakfast was brought around, and with that, a pound of unrisen wet bread, of a swamp-like sogginess, and the day began. Life began. With it came a mug of tea and 2 lumps of sugar. After an inspection at 9, someone might be summoned for a daytime interrogation. That suggested the interrogator felt it was going well. Otherwise, he would wait for night, or the prisoner would be transferred to Levortovo. Levortovo is a prison, similar security prison in another area of Moscow. If they were not required for interrogation, they could read, spectacles having been given back, play chess, talk. Late in the morning, the reflections of a few rays of light might struggle in through the chink of window, and the artificial light would be turned off. Prisoners rejoiced because it meant that the exercise period was near. For Sanya and his cellmates, this 20-minute walk took place on the Lubyanka roof, overshadowed by the chimney that served the furnace and bore off his diaries. Remember, when he was arrested, they found his diaries that were written in very small, almost code-like script. Unfortunately, for Sanya, the captain who was interrogating him did not bother to read the diaries. And because he was convinced the diaries had no bearing on the case, he had them burned, which for Sanya or Solzhenitsyn was both a relief and a horror, because a relief that the names in his diaries would not be followed up and those people would not be brought in for their own interrogation. But at the same time, Solzhenitsyn knew he wanted to be a writer, and so 4 years of writing what he saw during his time with the Red Army, both inside the Soviet Union and outside the Soviet Union, Poland and East Prussia, went up in flames. That served the furnace bore off his diaries and innumerable other testaments or works of literature. The walls rose around them to 3 times a man's height. The prisoners could hear, far below, the honking of car horns, telling them that life went on somewhere. But all they could see was the chimney, a guard in a tower above them, and wonderful, pathetic fallacy, that segment of God's heaven whose unhappy fate it was to float over this prison. He meets somebody who's interesting. I looked him up, Arnold Suzy. Still, they could breathe the fresh air, glimpse the sun. They were ordered to walk in pairs and not to talk. Reminds me of Midnight Express in a way, when the fella that's busted for hash gets thrown into a Turkish prison. It reminds me of walking in pairs in one direction, in a circle. But they managed to converse in whispers. Sanya learned to seek out Arnold Suzy, an Estonian lawyer, Estonia being one of the 3 Baltic states that Stalin invaded in 43 or 44. 44, I believe, the year before. For 20 years between the wars, Estonia had been independent. Highly regarded by his countrymen, Suzy might have become Minister for Education in an independent Estonia, but the Red Army rolled into the capital city of Tallinn in 1944. Suzy, a liberal Democrat, had been arrested with 14 other leading constitutionalists. They were all charged under Article 58-2 with a criminal desire for national self-determination. Walking on the Lubyanka roof with this mild-mannered intellectual who could speak fluent Russian, English, and German, Sanya received his first lesson in democracy. Remember, up until this point, Sanya or Solzhenitsyn is a supporter of communism. He doesn't know much about capitalism other than what the propaganda machinery in the Soviet Union has been telling him. Suzy spoke passionately for the virtues of a democratic parliament and constitution. such as his small Baltic country had drawn up from the best of European experience. This brief exercise time was when, without fear of being overheard by a stool pigeon or a bug, the two men could discuss politics. Returning to the cell after that fresh air was, for both of them, like being rearrested again. And there's a slight note here from the author of this autobiography, D.M. Thomas. He says, others took their place. At some point in the day, that unhappy segment of God's heaven, the walking grounds, the exercise yard, looked down on the shattered relic of Raoul Wallenberg, savior of Budapest Jews. He is believed to have been liquidated with poison in 1947. Kurt, have you heard of Wallenberg?
No, I haven't.
I heard about him through a PBS documentary, and Wallenberg was a Swedish diplomat who was assigned to Budapest in Hungary. And through his diplomatic efforts, the fact that the Swedish embassy was considered part of Swedish territory and they were neutral in the war, Wallenberg was able to help process the transit of, I think, 5,000 Jews out of Hungary, which was being overrun by the Nazis, and all the Jews were being rounded up and shipped in boxcars to concentration camps. And Wallenberg was able to get these, I think it was 5,000 Jews, out of Hungary to a safer place. The Russian Red Army came into Hungary. They fought the Germans, the Wehrmacht, kicked the Wehrmacht out of Budapest, and that's when, this was in 1944, that's when Raoul Wallenberg was arrested. And that was the last time people have ever heard of him, heard what happened to him. They just know that he was arrested by the NKVD, which came in with the Red Army, and that was the last he was heard of. According to D.M. Thomas, evidently, he had been kept in prison there, Lubyanka, where Solzhenitsyn was being held, and was later given poison. So it's sad. This was the first time I've heard of the fate of Raoul Wallenberg, and he is a hero. If you go to any Holocaust exhibit where they tell the history of the Holocaust during World War II, his name definitely comes up as one of the people that surfaced and, upon great personal risk, used his connections and his courage to bring a lot of people to safety who otherwise would have perished. So anyway, I think what I'm going to do is, it's 6:25. I'm going to stop there and just save the small piece about Cavendish and Solzhenitsyn, or the Solzhenitsyn family, till later. But just as a brief outline of what happened between Lubyanka and Cavendish, quickly, Solzhenitsyn was sentenced to 8 years for anti-Soviet activity, which is just about anything. A couple of bad words or cross words or criticism in a letter or on a telephone could get you 8 years in prison if that's picked up, and that could well implicate other people. Fortunately, the two people who received the letters were not implicated. Anyway, he spent the 8 years doing variety, being in different camps, anything from being a librarian to being part of a brick factory. Anybody who has worked in a brick factory knows it's very hard work. And at least I know in the Nazi concentration camps, if you were assigned the brick factory, you were not expected to make it 2 months. He was just there for 3 weeks, fortunately, and then he was transferred out. But he did his full sentence of 8 years, After that he wrote A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which sounds like Danielovich, which is somebody I know. Ivan Denisovich, and he wrote that in Albert Susi's summer cottage in Estonia. These two kept in touch even after Solzhenitsyn was transferred out of Lubyanka prison after his sentence was read by a judge. The two, him and Susi, kept in touch, and both were, after their sentences were served, they saw each other, and for 2 winters, Solzhenitsyn worked on the transcript, worked on the writing of A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which has been made into a movie, 1970, if you care to look it up. Tom Courtenay, who's a British actor, plays Ivan, the prisoner, who is the main character of the story. And it's not really a story, it's what happened to millions of people. And so he eventually, he under Khrushchev, who actually read A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich and liked the book because it fell in with his de-Stalinization program. Stalin died in 1953. Many people believe that he was pushed towards death by treated medicine or tainted or poisoned medicine that he was given. He was feared. He had no allies. He was just feared. And the country, many people breathed a sigh of relief, but they were anxious as to who was going to take his place. A peasant from the Ukraine who was a officer in the Red Army took over, Nikita Khrushchev. And some of you may remember when he met with, he was at the UN. He got people's attention by taking his shoe off and banging it on the desk. If you can imagine him at a restaurant calling the waiter, taking his shoe off and banging it on the desk. He was kind of rough around the edges, but he was the son of a peasant couple, and again staunch communists, obviously, but not one that was not one with the brutality that Stalin had. And so he liked the book. He wanted people to get away from the Stalinist idea of communism, and the publication of Solzhenitsyn's book helped him achieve that. Solzhenitsyn, unfortunately for the Soviet authorities, continued writing, and I believe it was Brezhnev who followed Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, who Richard Nixon dealt with. He gave Solzhenitsyn and his family an ultimatum: if you stay, we will put you back in jail for your writing. If you leave, you will be exiled, and you will lose your Russian citizenship. Not Russian, Soviet citizenship. There's a difference. And so he spent 2 years in Switzerland, in Zurich. He didn't care for it because he was constantly being visited. He complained he was not able to have quiet time to write. This guy wrote from 8 in the morning to 8 at night. He wrote and ate his meals. He had a meal with his family. I believe that was dinner, and that was it. So he wanted to leave Zurich. He was disillusioned with the West through Swiss eyes. And he was at a conference, I believe, in Boston or somewhere in New England. And he happened to be going through Vermont. He liked Vermont because Vermont reminded Solzhenitsyn of the area where he grew up, the forests, the mountains, the waterways. He wanted a four-season place, and we're talking 1976. definitely 4 seasons in Vermont in 1976. No global warming or climate change yet. So he had a friend who was in real estate find a town that he would feel comfortable in, a small town of maybe 1,000, 2,000 people, where he could have a secluded house and have his privacy and continue writing, because he was a writer. He was driven. And that's how he came to Cavendish. And when we meet next week, yes, next week at 5:45, we'll finish up our discussion of Solzhenitsyn by looking briefly at his 18-year stay, or the beginning of it, which is interesting. His beginning of his stay not only in the United States, but here in Vermont, in Cavendish. So, I invite you to tune back in next week. Kurt, did you have any other comments or questions that you'd like to bring out?
No questions, just that was an informative discussion. Thank you.
No, I'm fascinated by the fact that not only does this guy survive 8 years of the Gulag archipelago, because he went from one camp to the other over this period of time, but his body and his spirit were not broken. He died when he didn't die until he was born in 1917. He died, I think, he was born in 1918. I believe he died in 2008. He was 90 years old. And for someone to have lived through the physical and emotional torture of that type of existence in a work camp is miraculous, in my opinion. He did not give up. His spirit. It was interesting. He even, you can look this up on YouTube. They have his speech before Harvard graduating class in '78. And he actually has some interesting criticisms of how he sees the United States or capitalism through what he saw as a liberal mindset that could easily go off the tracks and be more of a threat than nuclear bombs. But anyway, interesting man. Again, tough as nails, opinionated, but I think people who are opinionated have that's based on values. So, Kurt, we will talk again soon off air. All right?
Okay.
And I thank you for joining us. And I thank everyone for joining. And I hope you tune in next Thursday. Have a good weekend, and God bless. So long, Kurt.
See you as well.
Bye-bye. Goodbye, everyone.